You remember Pac-Man, don't you? And in Pac-Man, for those of you with no culture, in Pac-Man, you chomped around the map and you ate all the dots. And usually in the corners, there were these bigger dots called power pellets. You remember? They're called power pellets. And if you ever got in a pinch when the ghosts were chasing you around the maze, if you ever got in a pinch, you could grab hold of a power pellet and you could turn the tide against your pursuers. You could turn the tide against your pursuers and you could eat the ghost and put them in the box. You remember that? It was great to put them in the box to turn the tide. That's how it should be in life, right? You just get a power pellet and you can turn the tide on your pursuers. And yet life is so often not that way. And we know it's not that way. And because we know it's not that way, we become cynical. We want to be able to turn the tide, but so often for us, there's no tide to turn. We're just stuck in the flow of things, and we have to go downstream, and we have to deal with life. And it creates over time an incredible anxiety that maybe this is just how it is. Some of us today, we showed up wondering if maybe this is just how it is. We would love to find the power pellet of life that would give us the strength we need to turn the tide, but we're cynical because if you're not cynical yet, you young people will learn the ways of the world. You're already learning them. What's your candy limit? You have a candy limit, don't you? At least that you can legally get. You have a candy limit. And at some point, your parents will say some cynical comment to you like this. They'll say, no, you can't have any more. You're going to get a stomachache from that. How do they know what's going to happen to you? How can they predict such a thing? And they'll say something to you, kids, like this. They'll say, listen, I know this because if I eat too much candy, I'll get a stomachache. And here we are eating too much candy, proving that our kids should get to eat more candy. Right, kids? Yeah. I knew I'd get at least an amen from somewhere. But cynicism sets in as we age. It's just a natural part of this life because here's what it is. We know how the world works. And we get to places in our life where we feel stuck because this is just how it has been, how it will be, how it's always going to be. And we become cynical because we can't sidestep the problems. And so eventually we just say, it's just going to be like this. This brokenness is always going to exist in our marriage, in our family, at every family gathering. It's going to exist with my job. It's going to exist with my trajectory of life. I'm just here, and I know what's coming next. The problem is, for us, cynics, the problem is that God doesn't work our way. So if it were left to just how this world works, you're right to be cynical. But God steps in and changes the whole equation. And our cynicism has to go somewhere to die. We have to learn to fully follow Christ. We have to learn to set aside our cynicism about where we're at now in order to grab hold of the vision that God has for us and the direction He's taking us. Cynicism is an enemy to the gospel work. And so today, here's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about setting aside this cynicism about God's work. I want to talk about how we can confidently trust in God's deliverance and in His presence. And so in order to do that, we need to take our Bibles. We need to look at Exodus chapter 4 because we've not been the first people who have been cynical about what God might promise to do. about what God is doing in our life, you realize, if anything, we justify our cynicism more than we justify anything else in our lives. The just the way it is syndrome impacts all of us. Most of us believe this scenario we're in right now is as good as it gets, unless you're young. And then you're like, eventually I'm going to eat as much candy as I want. And then you get older, and you know what you find out? Can't do that. See, I told you, this is worth being cynical in this world. You find out, don't you, in this life. And in order for us to set aside the anxiety and the frustration, and for many of us, the depression that surrounds us, we're going to have to grab hold of a different power. There's no power pellets for you. There's only the presence of God for you. And so look at your Bibles, Exodus chapter 4. We're going to pick up in verse 1. We're going to read together to verse 9, but we're covering all the way to 17. This is a whole block of text. We've been going slowly through these passages in this narrative because we need to grab hold of how God is unfolding this plan of redemption and deliverance. Last week we talked about how God revealed himself. He revealed his divine name. I'm to be called Yahweh by you. This is my name forever. When Moses asked and questioned God, they got into a competitions of who the bigger I am is. And Moses, remember, he says, look, this is impossible what you've sent me to do. And God says, yes, but I'll be with you. And then Moses said, well, let's suppose for a moment that I do what you say. Who am I to say sent me? And God responds back to Moses in kind of this indignation and says, I am existence that has sent you. The very nature of life, the very plan of the cosmos exists with God. And so when you say it can't be done, you forget to whom you're speaking. And so herein, then we come to Moses' persistent argument. This is so us. Yes, yes, following Jesus, all that, but this is us. Chapter 4, verse 1, let's read this together. Then Moses answered, but behold, usually when you say to God, but that whatever follows is your cynicism kicking in, and probably just flat out your disobedience. So when God speaks to you through his word, and then the following rebuttal comes out, it's just probably flat disobedience. All right, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. And the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? And he said, well, it's a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you. Again, the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand inside the cloak. And when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. And then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. And if they do not believe even these two signs, or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. And the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. Lord, we ask that you would guide us in your word this morning. Help us to hear from you, to lay aside the cynicism that lingers close to our hearts. Lord, that we might make the transformation in our mind, in our direction, in our plan, and be more faithful followers of Jesus. We ask this in the name of Christ. Amen. So here's what we find. We find Moses desperately trying to get out of God's demand on him. He desperately wants out of this, and it's going to unfold as he continues to argue. Notice in verse 10 what we didn't read yet. But Moses said to the Lord. You see, he's not done arguing yet. But in his first rebuttal, he says, listen, they won't believe me if I say to them that you've sent me. Now, if we were to back up in the passage, we would find out that God already said, when you go to them, they will believe you. But Moses then directly contradicts what God says and says, but they won't believe me. I know these people. I know how they are. They won't believe me. And so God gives him some signs, and we need to see how these unfold. There are 3 signs that are involved, and God begins with this rhetorical question that he expects Moses to answer, but that he certainly knows the answer to. He says, what do you have in your hand? We're going to talk about what's in your hand in a moment. But here's what cynicism is. Cynicism is disbelief wrapped in human reason. Cynicism is disbelief wrapped in human reason. Listen, cynicism is knowing what is inside the burning paper bag that somebody mysteriously left on your front porch. I don't even have to say what's in it, do I? You know what's in it. If that scenario happens to you, the question is never, I wonder what's in that. You already know what's in that. And cynicism is this way. It's a wrapper around disbelief. You could talk about the sack all day long, but it's obviously not the point, is it? Your cynicism makes sense to you because your cynicism is built on the odds. You know what? C-3PO was right when he counseled Han Solo not to go into the asteroid field. He said, in fact, that there's a 3,750 to 1 chance that they would survive the encounter with the asteroid field. He waved it off. He said, this is a bad idea. There's no way we will survive. It makes bad judgment to go against those kinds of odds. And in your life, you know it. Some of you are fact-checking me right now, aren't you? Hey, fact check away, bro. Already locked this in. You see, the odds make sense to us, and most of us are C-3POs. We're not Han Solos. We're flying this ship, and we know what happens when you go into the dangers of life. It's just the way things work. It's good judgment. It's maybe even prophetic on our part. If you do this, these things will happen. Your cynicism adds up to survivability. It adds up to a life that's built around the desire to get by, rather than a life that is part of a higher calling that God has laid out for you. Disbelief, this disbelief we have wrapped up in what we call good judgment, is always the well-worn path of sin. Han Solo had some skills, and Han Solo says, never tell me the odds. He rebuts this by saying, I have the skill to make it. And here's the question for us. When you're flying with the Lord, does He have the skill to figure it out and to help you make it? You see, our cynicism is wrapping up human disbelief. It looks reasonable. But when God steps into the picture, the odds change. He has both the skill and the power to overcome. In fact, righteousness is called faith in what God speaks. We were not counted righteous because we made good judgments. We were counted righteous because we believed who Christ is. Because we believed what God spoke. And so God has said, do this thing, Moses. And Moses has said, very reasonably, that's crazy. We can't forget it. Moses was absolutely being reasonable, you would not either have taken this jump. It's crazy. It's crazy. It'd be like telling some Afghan shepherd to go to the President of the United States and tell him to give over his country. It's not going to go well, right? That's exactly the kind of David and Goliath story that God has commanded Moses to walk into. So are we being foolhardy when we follow the Lord, when it's an impossible thing, when the odds don't make sense, when we're wrapped up in this cynicism, when we're saying we can't do it? Listen, we're only foolhardy to disbelieve God. That's the only place that foolhardiness comes from. So if God has called you forward, then it is right to go forward. You see, human reason has never accomplished the plan of God. That's just how it is, has never accomplished the plan of God. If it had been up to us, we would not have saved the world in the way that God saved the world. And yet, that's just how it is more often what's ruling our life, rather than the power and the purpose and the plan of God. I want you to see verse 10. Moses said to the Lord, "My Lord, I'm not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue." Now, some have argued that maybe Moses stuttered or something like that. Well, remember, Moses was brought up as an adopted son of the princess. He likely was enrolled in the Egyptian school. He was confused by Jethro's daughters for an Egyptian, so he definitely had the appearance and the look and the attire when he fled, and likely he had all the training. And one of the key training components of every royal court that's ever existed has been the formal easy speak of the court, of the king's court. You had to know how to address the king. Today, if you walked into the King of England's office, there would be certain protocols you had to follow. One of them would be you needed to kiss the hand. I guess they still do that. The other one would be you may not turn your back on him. So you could have to walk all the way across the room, and then you're going to have to back yourself out so that you don't turn your back to the king. Would you have known that? So you have to be taught these things. And Moses is likely saying, look, I did not get an A in speech class. I didn't do very well in that topic. You know I'm weak in this. And then God makes this incredible rebuttal to him. Verse 11. And we could talk a lot about this. We're going to just take a step. Listen, when people are born into this world with abnormalities of mind or body, things that are not in the normal sphere of things, I want you to hear me say this. They're conceived and they're born and they've been given life that is according to the plan and the choosing of God. And that means that all life is sacred and important to God. Okay, that's a side. We could talk a long time. Notice what God says. Then the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him," catch this, "mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." Notice then, there are 4 descriptors in verse 11. Mute, deaf, blind. All those things would be abnormalities, but notice the one that's not. Seeing is also thrown in there. Isn't that just the natural sensory skill that you're given based on normal development? Well, apparently even that is an elective choice of God that He provides to people. In other words, God's saying, you can't take anything for granted. I've made your mouth, so go, I'll be with your mouth, and I will teach you what you shall speak. Get over yourself, Moses. That's what he's saying. Get over yourself. Get over your bad grades of the past. Get over the brokenness of your past. I am calling you now, and I've equipped you now, and all the equipping you need later I will do. But look, verse 13. Moses is dedicated. But he said, now remember, he's still before the burning bush that doesn't burn up, right? He's still there. Presumably still on his knees. We've taken several weeks to talk through this, but this has been a rather quick process. There's not been a lot of dialogue. Verse 13, but he said, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." And just for a moment, in my mind's eye, I see the flame around the bush burst in a fury. That's what I see happen. And notice what God says, verse 14, then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. I can see it. And he says, notice, he doesn't directly rebuke him, but he also doesn't let him off. Some of us think that doing the will of God is optional. Buckle up, buttercup. Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he's coming out to meet you. In other words, he's already on his way. And when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff with which you shall do the signs. It's a beautiful passage about our human cynicism. You see, human reason says a few different things, makes a few different excuses. First, we say, they will not believe me. So in other words, we blame them. Listen, God, here's the problem with your plan. They won't believe it. God said, they will believe you, and so go. Moses says, well, they probably maybe won't believe me. And he blames them. God is undeterred by this, and he says, listen, I'll even give you some signs. If we're into magic tricks, let's just do some tricks for them, and then maybe they'll believe you. Never mind that I said they would. So sometimes our cynicism comes out in this form. We say, well, they're to blame. This is why I can't do what you're telling me to do, because they are to blame. You ever made that argument? Or the second argument you might make is, like Moses says, I'm not eloquent. I can't speak well. I remember as an 8-year-old kid first thinking about being a pastor, and I've told this story before, and I sat there and I was a shy kid, and I thought there is no way that a shy kid like me, who can hardly speak to my teachers or to my classmates, could ever stand in front of all these people. I mean, if you were talking about terror as a movie, it would be little Kevin having to stand right here and say these things. And I thought there is no way that God would ever do that. So maybe it's more noble. He blames himself. And God says, oh, but I created all your skills or all your lack of skills. I created everything that you are. So what else you got, Moses? Do what I've ordered you to do. Some of us were saying, look, I'm just too weak to do this. Some of us are saying, look, I've had too bad of a past. Some of us are saying, everything is chaos right now. I need some chance for it to kind of fold in. And we're telling God, wait. We're blaming our own weakness, feeling like it's noble, but it's disobedience and cynicism nonetheless. When God calls and whispers in your ear to follow him, he is determined. And so notice then how it shifts. He says, they'll not believe me. And then he says, I don't have the skill, it's my fault. And then notice the change. Please send someone else. And this is, I think, not just the culmination of Moses' holdout against God that the Lord's angry with, but it's what it implies. Moses is saying to God, you picked wrongly. Try again. You picked wrongly. Try again. Every one of us has a calling from the Lord. Some of us have a title over that calling. It's a well-worn path, and we know what it is. It says pastor or missionary or whatever it says. It's easier in some ways to have the title that you can fit on it, but all of us, nonetheless, title or not, have a calling from the Lord. And when we refuse, when we hold out against God, here's what we're saying. You picked wrongly when you placed me in your kingdom. Really, who's to blame then for this job being impossible? I told you I couldn't do it. I told you they wouldn't believe me. But really, God, you're the problem with your plan because you don't know how it is. I think that's where the Lord's anger is kindled against Moses. But when God presides, when His presence shows up, He neutralizes human excuses. This is why if cynicism is in charge of your life, if that cynicism exists there, then you are deflecting God's plan because fundamentally you're making some kind of excuse for why it can't all work out. You're even making the excuse that it's just not a good time for you right now. Who gave people their time on this earth? Who brought them to this place? Who has offered that calling and demanded they respond? Was it convenient for Levi, the tax collector, reviled by all the people, to get up from his tax collecting booth and follow the Lord? I would say I doubt it, but the Bible lays out for us that Levi immediately got up and followed. It was not convenient, and when God calls, it's not convenient, but it is always timely. So notice then kind of this last feature, these miracles that are swirling here, because we all love a miracle. And God introduces this whole set of miracles in verse 2 when He asks and points attention to the staff in Moses' hand. You see that? Now this is an odd framing. It kind of sticks out of the narrative as an interesting feature. The staff would have been common to everybody. Everybody in that day would have had a staff. In fact, if you went on a hike and you're a gear kind of guy like I am, you found yourself some kind of walking pole because it's one more piece of gear that you can take with you. I love gear. It's terrible for everybody, but I love gear. And when we went to the Grand Canyon, we were going to hike a lot, so we brought hiking poles for all of us. My kids are much smaller then. We bought all these hiking poles. We hiked a total of like 2 miles in the whole 10-day trip to the Grand Canyon. There's a lot of hiking you can do in the Grand Canyon. But when you take the 1 mile hike down into the Grand Canyon, that gets you almost to the first lookout point that's supposed to be spectacular. And you realize that you've been descending on switchbacks and downward trails and all that, and you start feeling a little hotness, a little, you need some water and you don't have enough, and then you look back up. You're a mile in, and you've got the hard mile back out. And so we made it about 2.3 miles on that hike, I think, all told. But we had walking poles. Everybody had walking poles in this day. A staff, something super common. And God just simply asks, what is that in your hand? Okay, Moses, you're going to hold out what's in your hand. And this staff will become, for Moses and for the story, almost its own character. It is a stand-in representation of God. It's almost as if God is saying, look, okay, you want evidence that I'm going to be with you and that I'm going to be around? What are you holding right now? What do you still have? Oh, well, I have a staff. Okay, let's take the staff then, since that's what you have, and let's put it to work. Do you want to know what God can use in your life to accomplish His purpose? What do you have in your hand? Because that's all God needs for the beginning. What's in your hand? And I ask you that same question this morning. If you've been cynical, if you've been holding out on the Lord, if you've been resisting His calling, here's your question. What is that in your hand that you have right now? What are you currently in possession of? Now, I did a little research on magic wands via Harry Potter, because if there had to be a resource for the everything about magic in our day, then it would probably be Harry Potter. I never saw any of the movies or read any of the books, but I know that they all had magic wands. That's just kind of what you have. And it's interesting. The magic wand in that context has its own power. It's considered semi-autonomous. But what it helps to do is channel the power of the wizard. Kids, you hear me? This is fiction. And we're talking about fantasy here, and we ought not deal with witchcraft at all, but I just go with me for a second, okay? And what it helped do is channel the magician's powers. But it also kind of had a life of its own. That's not what's going on with the staff here. You see, this is exactly the problem for our cynicism. We think maybe we could channel our own power if we could grab hold of one more teaching, one more super Bible verse. I mean, yes, there's all these Bible verses, but what about a super one? I hear this in some churches stating the name Jesus Christ almost as an incantation against evil. And I tell you, that's not the intention. It's not that we can say a thing, make an incantation, find the power within, a pseudo selfishness involved or self-empowerment involved with the work that God will do. The staff simply represents something so common that it was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. And God picks it because it is absolutely worthless in the broader scale of matters. It stood in, Moses, if you won't believe except what you can see, then look, you have a staff in your hand, I'll do my work through the staff. It's a concession to Moses. It represents the presence of God, but it is not God. In other words, God is simply saying, Moses, you won't have any power, but that's exactly the point. You don't need any power to do this work. You need the presence of God to do this work. And I tell you this morning, Moses' work here, it's not about a spiritual moment. Listen, can you imagine a spiritual moment like Moses is currently having? While he's arguing with a burning bush that is on fire but is not burning up. He's having a spiritual moment, isn't he? I mean, let's just consider for a minute that the Lord blows me off the stage and the stage catches fire but it's not burned up. You're having a spiritual moment in that moment, aren't you? But you know what? It would make you no more obedient than you already are. Some of us think, oh man, if I had the right spiritual moment, just the right time, then I would get it together. Case in point, no, you wouldn't. And so God simply says, listen, here's what's required: an obedient step. I'll give you something to prop up your disbelief, but you're doing this. Take the staff. Notice it comes back up in verse 17. And take in your hand this staff so that you can do these signs. Repeat them in front of the people. What you have, all the commonness of your life, is enough for God to use. It's not about exceptional skill. I mean, Napoleon Dynamite was right. Chicks dig skills, but in God's economy, you don't need skills for Him to call you to His purposes and His work. In fact, your skills will more likely get in the way than they will aid with anything. They're common to people. They're probably not even the best in that skill set that there could be in this world, but the calling of God is unique to you, and He calls you out to follow Him. What you need with that obedient step and what you need into the future is a readiness to respond to God today, a readiness today. You need to be willing and primed to say yes to the Lord today. Remember, you can go a long time without God showing up in overt ways like this. Most of us are never, ever in our life going to get a moment like this. And if you get one, you can come give testimony about it on a Sunday morning. We want to hear about it. But because God has opened His Word in front of you right here this morning, He's chosen to speak to you. He talks now to you. And readiness for today is more important than some skillfulness or exceptional talent that you have. Third, we find that our weaknesses are not limiting God. You're not waiting to become the superhero. You're not waiting to upscale your life from where it's at now. Some of you are anxious that you're never going to achieve, you're never going to get there, you're never going to heal, you're never going to whatever it is. That this is just how it is. And listen, in just how it is comes the Word of God to transform it to something totally new. You're not waiting for that time. God is already calling and speaking into that time. You're not waiting to become something better. You're called even now. And here's the final thing, just to cap off the desire to be cynical, because we love to be cynical. It gets us out of a lot of stuff. Honey, you need to mow the yard. Well, the lawnmower's broken. Gets you out of a lot of stuff, doesn't it? Well, why don't you go fix the lawnmower and then mow the lawn? Well, I don't know how to fix the lawnmower. Why don't you take it to somebody who knows how to fix the lawnmower and then mow the lawn? And you say, well, we don't have any money, so I can't pay the guy. He's just like, well, I've got an extra $100. Take it to somebody who can fix it. And you say, well, I don't know anybody good. Those guys are all cheats. Cynicism gets you out of a lot of stuff. But here's the problem. Cynicism never gets you out of the call of God. You can't excuse your way out of what God desires to do. And some of you are like, dude, I've been holding God off for a long time. You only wish you were that tough. God just hasn't buckled down on you yet. Your time has not yet come. You see, Moses thought his time had come earlier in life, and it seems appeared to jump out ahead of what God would do. But the reality is he was never going to wiggle out of this, and we are never going to wiggle out of this. This is not a choice that God is offering to you, but a demand that He is making of you. And so when the Scripture tells us, when Jesus says, I'm sending you to all the world to make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, and I'll be with you. Listen, that calling is not like someday I hope you get spiritual enough to answer it. You'll never get spiritual enough if you don't answer it now. God has called you today, now, youngsters and oldsters. He's called you out today. And we respond today. Some of us, it's just simply saying, okay, Lord, I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to open my heart and I'm going to risk it. So this is your question. What is already in your hand as a part of God, what God is already doing? And for some of us, He's helping us escape sin, compulsive sin, regular sin, whatever it is. For others of us, He's got us in school. We need to buckle down. We need to do it. For others of us, we're in early married life and we're trying to figure it out, or we're new parents, or we're whatever we are. For some of us, we're in a marriage crisis and we got to figure that out. And I'm telling you, the calling of God is the same. Figure it out. Yield to God. Be ready for what God will do. He is bringing all things new. So it's not always about outside of us that needs to change. It's also always about what's inside of us that needs to be transformed. And so today, if you're in a place, a bad spot, a hard spot, an anxious spot, then I tell you, at least what God is calling you to do is turn and face the sin and the brokenness of life. Truthfully, honestly, and open to God's grace. For some of you, you're right at the margin. You're going through life change. You're there right now. Tracy and I are there. Our kids have flown out of the nest, and we're in the transition. Others of you, you're about to graduate high school. Others of you, you're about to go from being third graders to fourth graders. And that's a big jump. For the others of you, you've been retired so long, you just know that today is Sunday, and you count every day based on that appointment and the doctors you go to see. And you're wondering if there's more to life than that. Others of you, you're in mid-career right now, and you're wondering, man, is this just the drudge that I'm in? But listen, I don't think it would take much thought on your part to say, how can I respond today to what God desires to do? Some aspect of your heart, some aspect of your actions, some aspect of your relationships needs transformation. Here's how we deflect. We say, well, my whole life is a mess. That's deflection. Deflection is everything's wrong, therefore I will not focus on one thing that's wrong. And what you know is that the Holy Spirit is talking to you about that one thing. And you're cynical about it ever healing. So what is that in your hand? The common thing. God is going to transform it in you to in league with His extraordinary purposes. Because that's what God is doing. He's making more home for Himself in your heart. He's making more vision in your mind for what He will do. To fire the engines of gospel work. That's what Christ is doing today. Some of you, today is about salvation. Belief in Jesus for the first time. I mean, you got the facts. You know about Christ. You've heard somebody say something, a family member or whatever. But you're like, I just don't know if I can believe that. I see out there a lot of people who don't believe that. Well, maybe God's not real. You see, you just used the three cynical excuses. It's them, it's me, it's God for your unbelief. Because it just doesn't make sense with this world. I'll tell you this, the world doesn't make sense without the saving work of Christ. And today you're called to salvation. Father, as we prepare for a time of